Good morning. Appreciate everybody being here this morning, especially those of you here in the room, but also those that are joining us online. We appreciate your attendance and participation in our class. We're studying the book of Exodus this quarter. And if you may remember from week one, we talked about the burning bush and how Moses was there with God, and he shared his name, I am. Also Yahweh, as it's written many times. Week two, we showed his power, God's power with the plagues and other ways of demonstrating his power for the Israelites. We talked about God providing for his people, and he provided manna and water and meat for them along their journey. We talked about God saving his people, and in particular the crossing of the Red Sea and how that demonstrated God's power. And then week five, the way of faithfulness. We talked about the Ten Commandments, and you remember Larry taught about that, and we had the demonstration of his power when he spoke those 10 commandments to the people. And today, we're going to be talking about the faithlessness at the mountain. We're going to talk about how Israel rebelled against God. And most of our lesson today will be coming from Exodus chapter 32. We'll bounce around a little bit with some other references, but primarily from Exodus 32. First, we'll talk about kind of an outline, how idol worshipers distort the worship of God. And then in Exodus 32, 7 through 14, idol worshipers deserve the judgment of God. And finally, in Exodus 32, verse 1 and 34, and 1 through 4 through 9, idol worshipers depend on the grace of God, as do we. The first passage here is from Exodus 32, 1 through 6, and we'll read this. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountains, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. My first question is, how can this be? We're going to talk about how quickly the people rebelled against God, even after his demonstrations of power before them. So why are humans prone to worship images and idols? Well, one is because humans are comfortable with what they can see and touch. And God cannot be seen or touched. And so I think that may be one reason that that happens. The rebellion is extremely quick. Less than 2 months since leaving Egypt, and immediately before they left Egypt, there were the plagues, the powerful demonstration of God's power, the water to blood, the frogs, lice, flies, locusts, hail, ultimately the death of the firstborn. Was extremely powerful, and even though God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, they were powerful enough to eventually, with the death of the firstborn, to convince him. And yet the people less than 2 months later, after all that happened, are making idols and are rebelling against God. It's been less than a month since the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. That iconic event where the Red Sea parted and the people of Israel walked across on dry land. And then when the Egyptians came in, the waters came back and destroyed them. Not one of them remained, it said. What a demonstration of God's power. And yet here they are less than a month later, and they're rebelling and making idols and attributing their coming out of Egypt to this golden calf instead of the one true God. They have been seeing manna and water being delivered to them. That's a miraculous way of feeding God and for God to show his presence to them. When they grumbled about the food, they got this bread in the morning that was like coriander seed made with honey. And then in the evenings, the quail would come and they would be able to gather the quail. So they were eating bread and meat, and water was delivered to them when they didn't have water from a rock. Another demonstration of God's great power. The 10 Commandments had been delivered to them just a few days before. If you may remember, in Exodus 20, God spoke the 10 Commandments to the people. And then they're about to be written on the tablets, but they're already breaking the commandments that were spoken to them just days before. And the very first two were the ones that were being broken. They were led by a cloud and a pillar of fire. Every day they saw, in the daytime, this pillar of fire. At night, they saw this cloud that they were led by. And it was leading them on their journey, gave them directions on where to go and when to go. Sometimes it would stay still, so they were supposed to stay there. When it moved, they were supposed to move. What an indication of God's presence to them. Every day they saw this. Every day they got up in the morning and they saw the presence of God with this cloud. And when they went to bed, when they were at night, they saw this presence of God with this pillar of fire, constantly reminding them of God's presence, and yet they're making this idol. The people broke the first and second commandments before they were ever written on the tablets. They had been spoken to them, and God even reminds them of these two commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself a graven or carved image. They've already broken the very first two commandments right away. I'd mentioned before, God had given the commandments to them verbally in Exodus 20, so that it's not like, well, we didn't know that was a rule that you had. They couldn't say that because it had been communicated to them. When he did communicate with them, it kind of scared the people with his presence, the thunder and lightning and smoke. When Larry's class a couple of weeks ago, he had a little video display of God's presence and the thunder and the lightning and the smoke that came on the mountain really was showing the great power of God. And it kind of scared them. And so they asked, well, don't speak to us anymore, Lord. You scare us to death. Speak through Moses and let him tell us what to do. And so Moses does that. And in Exodus 20, after all the commandments are listed, the 10 commandments, just after that, God emphasizes two. He says in Exodus 20:23, do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. So which ones did he emphasize? The first two, after he'd already listed them, and which ones did they break? The ones that were emphasized, the ones that God reminded them. I guess, maybe speculating, God knew that they might have a tendency to do this, having seen it so much in Egypt around them. So where did they get the jewelry that they used to make the golden calf? From the Egyptians. Another miracle. Why would the Egyptians give their jewelry of gold to the slaves, Hebrew slaves? Why would they do that? There's no reason they would, except that God put it in their heart to do it. And so God caused that to happen. So the jewelry, the very jewelry that they used to make the golden calf was jewelry that God gave them as they left Egypt by way of the Egyptians. So they had that as, I guess, a monetary way to go to the future, that God caused them to do this, and yet they used that jewelry in a way to create this God in place of the one true God. So the people said, they were kind of impatient. Moses had been up on the mountain for a while. Seems like I read it was like 30 days, so quite a while, but not long enough to forget God or forget his presence or to forget what he had done for them. But nevertheless, Moses had been up on the mountain for a while when they got impatient and started asking for this carved image. In chapter 24, verse 3, after being delivered the Ten Commandments, the people said they would willingly follow all of God's commands. So they even verbalized that we will do what you ask, including those first two commandments and all the other commandments as well. But they verbally responded that we will follow God's commands. And this is what happens with idols. They distorted the true worship of God, exchanging his glory for something that's created. In this case, a golden calf representing a calf. And there are other religions which deify animals of different kinds, or some object like the sun, or in case cattle, other things that are objects that they substitute as God, which doesn't make a lot of sense to us, does it? That would be the case, but it is. They were probably copying what they had seen in Egypt. The Egyptians were idol worshipers. Calves may have been one of the things they worshiped. And so they were probably copying what they had seen there in Egypt, even though they had been called out to be very separate from Egypt, to be God's people, to follow God and his commandments, to be very different from the Egyptians. They're copying what the Egyptians did. And then their worship devolved into hedonistic revelry. It rose up to play. That term, rose up to play, I understand from the original implies some sort of sexual immorality involved as well. And so they are totally, once they get into this mindset of worshiping this calf, that kind of throws out all their morality rules, and they become something totally different than what a godly worshiping nation would be. Distorted worship leads to distorted lives that do not follow God's commands, which is what basically I just said. This map is not very clear. I apologize for that. I'm going to try to use my pointer here a little bit. This was the map we showed before, and this is one possible route of the Israelites as they left Egypt. We talked a few weeks ago about the fact that there's a lot of dispute about where they crossed the Red Sea. One is way up here, which is a very shallow, marshy land. One is, like this one is showing, is here. The other is this Gulf of Aqaba, is the crossing could possibly be here. I tend to believe this latter one, but that's just one person's opinion. This says that the Mount of Sinai is right here. But other historians and people that should know say that it's over here in the land of Midian. If you remember when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, he told him that when you come back and leave Egypt, you're going to come back to this mountain and worship me. And he was, if you remember, that when he was working for Jethro, his father-in-law, Zipporah's dad, he was working in the land of Midian. And so that would seem to support that the burning bush was here in Midian, and therefore maybe Mount Sinai is here in Midian. But in either case, whether it's here, I think the more important thing is that what happened here, and of course the giving of the Ten Commandments was a big thing, but also this rebellion by the people of Israel. The next passage we're going to look at is verses 7 through 14 of chapter 32. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen the people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them and may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.' But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from the disaster that against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit forever.' And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people." So God is omnipresent. He could still be with Moses and talking to him and giving him the commandments and know what the people of Israel were doing down below at the bottom of the mountain. So, and he's omnipresent today. He knows what we're doing. He knows where we're at. He knows when we're rebelling. God is always aware. And then if you'll notice that in that first verse, it didn't say, so those who were God's people are now your people, talking to Moses. Your people. Go down for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. Interesting how God kind of changes the terminology there. Instead of his people, they're Moses' people now. God called them stiff-necked because of their rebellion. And this sin was not a small sin and deserved severe punishment. And so God was not inappropriate in his wrath towards them, his wrath that was kindled to him. They deserved a swift and quick punishment. But God said, leave me alone, when he was talking to Moses. So did God need to have Moses' permission before he issued his punishment? Could God not have just did it and not said anything to Moses? He absolutely could. So many think that what this leave me alone message to Moses really was sort of an invitation for Moses to implore on behalf of the people of Israel. God is a God of grace, and God wants his people to be fruitful. Israel did not get what they deserved, but rather God showed grace and mercy. So Moses implored on their behalf. God relented, it says, and did not destroy them. When describing God's having human emotions like relenting or changing his mind, it may be more of an analogy, but not necessarily the exact thing as human emotions, because God is not human. God is a deity. So I don't know how to communicate to you what the difference is, because I'm not deity. I don't know what God's emotions are like, but it may be that they're different from humans. Moses interceded for the people, and God showed grace and mercy. Jesus is our intercessor who appeals to God's grace and mercy on our behalf. So there's maybe an analogy here between what Moses was doing for the people of Israel and what Jesus does for us. We usually don't get what we deserve either, do we? We get something much better than what we deserve. We get grace and mercy. And Christ, from Hebrews 11, is a superior intercessor to Moses, as Christ is the righteous one who has never sinned and pays the penalty of our sin as our atoning sacrifice. So Moses was a great intercessor for the people of Israel, but Jesus is even a greater intercessor for us as Christians. This is the last passage in this that we'll be looking at. This is from chapter 34. The Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. So Moses had broken the first set of tablets as he came down the mountain and saw the people worshiping the calf. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first, and he rose early in the morning and went up to the Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the same name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and what's the word? I can't read it. Abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, for who will by no means clear the guilty, thank you, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generations. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. Sorry for that, my reading skills are difficult from here. Moses had broken the original tablets of stone back in Exodus chapter 32, verse 19. And there was some punishment for the people, even though God had grace. God is a just God, and so there was some punishment. Moses made the people drink water with the golden calf ground into powder. So he made them drink this water with all the grounded, and then there was God punished them with a plague. I don't know the nature of this plague, but God punished them with a plague. And God then agreed to write the commandments on 2 new tablets of stone. And the covenant with God had been broken by the people, but God was gracious. It says that the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses. I think that was an interesting phrase. Oftentimes we see God and cloud associated. He used a cloud to lead them. When he would go into the tent of meeting, there would be a cloud that descended on the tent when Moses went in to meet with God and talk. Um, um, God Jesus ascended in the clouds, it says, and he said he will come back the same way. So clouds kind of frequently used in using God's presence. Verses 6 and 7 are a description of God that is repeated multiple times in the Old Testament. It says, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in the steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. You know, we talk about that we can find something about the nature of God in the scriptures. That's how we learn about God. This is a verse packed with the characteristics of God. He's merciful. He was merciful then, he's merciful now. A gracious God. Slow to anger. Love describes God. God is love. God is forgiving, but he is also just. So those are some characteristics we learn about God throughout the scriptures, and I've listed some of the scriptures that kind of repeat this passage throughout the Bible. And we see some pieces of that repeated often about being faithful, loving, forgiving. Steadfast love is a term that's used often in the scriptures to refer to God. It does not mean that he is not just and does not give punishment. We serve an awesome God, one that's powerful, and that while merciful and gracious, is also just. Knowing God's character, knowing these things about God, should inspire us, motivate us to live differently because of that. We should live in obedience to him because of that. It should give us strength to turn away from sin. We should extend grace and mercy to others, just as God has extended grace and mercy to us. This is an artist rendering. I don't know how close this is to the real thing. We will never know. But this is a depiction of Moses about to break the tablets as he sees, you can see in the background, the worshiping of the golden calf by the people. As good as any, I guess, description that we have. So, an interesting definition I saw of idolatry. Idolatry is pursuing anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. And maybe you could stop right there as a definition of idolatry. Pursuing anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, with the hope that it will give you what only God can give. So with that definition, we're not talking just about idols made of gold or calves or any kind of the Greek gods depictions that we see. More than just that. In the Old Testament, idolatry would lead Israel away from loving God and loving one another. It was a weakness of theirs. You will also notice in life that pleasant people who suddenly come into wealth, success, and fame are often dramatically changed to reveal their deepest desires. Anger, entitlement, and control can quickly become unmanageable. You've seen that in life. You've seen that in people, not necessarily people that are world-renowned, but people in your own life who are changed quickly once they become either rich or in a position of high control. Do I? Money does. Money does impact people. It sure does. And you've seen that. I've seen it in my life, people that were affected that way. We do see celebrities and stars sports figures, TV and movie stars. They're often ruined by fame. They enjoy the attention of cameras, the lights, and the fans, but once the show is over, they find that money, fame, and success hasn't satisfied them. We see those stories are very public, maybe unlike some of the ones I was just referring to, but those are very public stories that you see who commit suicide, who do other things that are really uncharacteristic of them before their fame, it's fairly common. So idol worshipers deserve the judgment of God. If God had not allowed Moses to intercede, I mean, he could have, if he wanted to, could have destroyed the people of Israel right there and started over. That's what they deserved. But that's not what they got. Not only Israel, but us today. We don't get what we deserve because we are weak, we are sinful. We deserve punishment. God is a gracious God, a merciful God, and we're so thankful that we have Jesus, who was an atonement for our sins. He died so that we could have that mercy and grace. Idol worshipers depend on the grace of God. And I'm not just talking about worshipers of calves and objects, people that are absorbed by something greater than God to them, something that they would spend their time. Sometimes that could be something like a job that you are so focused on, so dedicated on that you push out God. This morning, Ryan was talking about the noise in our life that pushes out God because we can't hear, because we've got all this other stuff that we're more dedicated to than God. And so this is something for us, not just the Israelites, it's something for us to be wary of and careful about. Not only Israel, but us today. Hope that this has been helpful to you. We'll, next week, Tommy's going to be teaching as we go through this book of Exodus. And I hope that as we do so, we not only learn about the character of God, we learn about the Israelites and what they did, and maybe learn from their example, maybe bad example, but learn from their examples, learn from the character of God, and that we will be better people because we are trying to not follow that same path. So thank you for your attention today, and look forward to seeing you next week.